Okay, I think that we will start.
Should we start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for choosing us over a very other interesting discussion. But thanks. Today we will be discussing how to effectively communicate evaluations. And I'm Saleha Wasim. I do communications for the Independent Evaluation Department at the Asian Development Bank. And it was it was part of the plan to have two non-communications people who are also communicators as part of the panel. So there's Nilakshi Man from 3IE. I think you've heard her speak at the various sessions during...
Just one.
Just one?
Yeah.
Okay. And Jeff Chelsky, who you've seen at every second panel discussion. That's a seat. Mr. Panelist. To remind you, this is about communications. Yeah.
I'm a non-communicative person.
Okay. And the way we are seated is also something that we did very purposely because we want to communicate with you. We want to have an interaction and a dialogue. We didn't want to speak down at you. So what I'll do is I'll just give you an overview of what we do at the Independent Evaluation Department, what we do, why we do it, and a couple of good practices. And then I'll hand over the mic. We all have our own mics, but to Nilakshi. So let's just, there's a cartoon there which could be true for many organizations. That we sometimes get so wrapped up by our evaluations that we probably don't have the energy left or the resources left. And I think there's very little use for that report if you do not take it out and spread the word. So also the production team has got a little bit of a poll. So you have this. How often do you engage with your communications team during an evaluation? You can select one. And the second question is?
Access it.
I'll just tell you. Can we put our hands up? And what stage do you engage with key users of your evaluation findings? Select one. We'll just tell you how to do it shortly. We'll come back for the answers at the end of the session. So I'm happy to click if you, yeah.
You go to menti.com and use the code.
Menti.com, use the code.
We didn't communicate the rules very well. Depends on the communication officer.
There's a like. What's the like?
Mm-hmm. Are the answers still coming? Okay. All of the above is a clear winner here. It's good to see that final results is still at 3 during evaluation design, all of the above. Yeah? Okay, I think the picture is clear. It does seem that all of you are communicating all the time, which is really, that's the way it should be. Just a couple of, and there's a question mark here. Are these really communication myths? We'll come back at the end of the presentation to see if it's still considered a myth. And these are some of the issues that my team as communications team face, and these are real issues. For example, what is communications? it's very commonplace to think that it is either blogs or these are events or publications. And as evaluators, of course, we know who to communicate to, what the messages should be, and when to communicate. But is that a myth or a reality? Okay. So because there is a mixed group here, for some of you, the answer is going to be very obvious. But why boost evaluation knowledge sharing? I mean, obviously, because these findings are very crucial to make informed decisions. And so they have to be communicated. The evaluation results have to be communicated clearly, precisely, and succinctly. And using various knowledge products, specific to the kind of audiences that we are trying to communicate to. For improved development outcomes, effectiveness. This is also part of the IED mandate. Apart from the fact that, yes, it needs to be done, it is a part of the independent evaluation policy, evaluation principles. It's also demand of DMCs, the countries, and the board requests. And also periodically, we have a strategy for communications, which is a living document. And first in 2018 and very recently in 2021, we've conducted stakeholder analysis, and we keep updating it. What is the kind of messages that the audiences want? What is the form that they want in? What are the kind of products that are aligned with the audiences? Okay, now just a little bit to explain that this is what the evaluation cycle looks like. And of course, communications flows through the cycle. But these are the places that we have built in communications. So at the evaluation approach paper stage, very recently, and with a little bit of a behavior change that was required, we have a communications matrix where we identify the audiences that we would need to communicate with at the end of the evaluation. We have the key messages. We have the tools that we would use to communicate. It's a living document through the approach paper stage, and later on, it can be updated. So this is the first place where communications actually comes in. And then it's the disclosure of the evaluation report. So after meeting the DG's approval and before the Development Effectiveness Committee, mostly about 15 days before the deck, it is put on our website. So that's the second stage of communication. And then after the Development Effectiveness Committee discussion, the news release is the first outside communication that goes. And we message it out, we put the report out to the public. And then it is the full-blown communication. The first thing that we do is, after the discussion with the board of directors, we have an event which is called What Works, What Doesn't, and Why. There's by now a formula to it. We have a board of director. We have one of the senior management who represent the management. And then we have a technical staff to talk about the technical aspect of the report. And this event is open to the ADB-wide audience, to the staff. So this flags off the dissemination process of the evaluation report. Very quickly, like I'm sure that that's true of the World Bank, it's definitely true of us, that we have these various reports, the products that we have, from projects to sectors, country, thematic, corporate. So there's not one size that fits all. For example, if it's a corporate communication, it has more internal audiences naturally that need to be addressed. So the communication tools that we will use will be very different from what we would do if it was country. And these are the various aspects of communications through partnerships. We disseminate our reports on the systems and databases. We have outreach and learning events, knowledge dissemination through knowledge products actually, and through capacity development. There's obviously some sort of an overlap between communications and capacity development. What we're trying to achieve is make the evaluations accessible, valued, influential, and used, leading to hopefully evaluation knowledge and improved development effectiveness. Very quickly, to understand, to tailor, I mean, I think that this is engage with the audiences, leverage the goodwill, and in the end, measure. So a lot of it is actually work in progress. We try to do it. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed. But this is ideally the gold standards of what we try to achieve. Some of the institutional challenges that we have, I think it would be not very specific to us, but it's all embedded. The way we approach it is that we have the strategical evaluation knowledge management plan. Some of these, all of you would recognize. I'll start with trying to balance accountability and learning in our product, right? And how we do it, I'll tell you. How we try to do it, I'll tell you. Changing knowledge needs. One very case in point is when COVID struck. So we had a work plan, but we had to be nimble and change the products and obviously the audience and what we were doing, the platforms that we were using. Credibility of evaluations also, or the perception of the credibility of evaluations is also something that is a challenge. Lack of incentives to learn. It's very often said that, okay, so what is the incentive for us to communicate? What is the incentive for us to indulge in developing knowledge products? Organization culture where accountability is seen as a blame. This is any of the MDBs that we've spoken to, we have great difficulty in using the platforms of the corporate, the communications team. We all have a department of communications because they look at the messages that we are trying to bring as reputational risk. They would not talk about what went wrong. They'd rather talk about what went right. So that's also a challenge. I'll go on to the next slide now. And the next slide is about how, in our own way, we try to address these things. I spoke about the changing knowledge needs. We came up with evaluation headlines, the live version of which you saw on the inaugural day. Credibility, we do it in many ways. We try to have champions, whether it is the managing director general. The picture that you see here was the president. He had come to speak at a Managing for Development Results platform where the ECG members were there. That did lead to catching a lot of eyeballs and, So in our little ways, I'd like to play this very interesting video that we have of balancing learning and accountability. We did a country engagement mission, and in the closed door discussion that we had with a very specific group of people, we spoke about what worked, what didn't work in our engagement with Uzbekistan. But when we spoke to the television, we tried to package it in a way that we did not compromise on the Uzbekistan resident mission's credibility as well, but we said what we had to say.
Is that
I can ad-lib if you like. I remember this by heart.
Is that a communication failure?
Plans to invest $5 billion to support Uzbekistan's economy in the next 5 years. This was reported in an event on Assessment Matters, Lessons from Uzbekistan. The event shared evaluation experiences and lessons learned from the ADB's activities in Uzbekistan over the past decade. Details from my colleague Dilrabo Atajanova.
ADB's independent evaluation department assessed the effectiveness of Uzbekistan development operations and provide feedback to improve the strategies and operations. The event discussed the role of these assessments on decision-making in the government of Uzbekistan. What's role the evaluation data can play in the government decision-making?
Evaluation can help the government make informed choices. We have the right data, they would know what works and what doesn't, and would really help them to move forward in the right way if they had this kind of information. So one constraint is that it has to be written in a way that is constructive rather than just saying what is bad or and be more positive. The other is to make sure that there's capacity to do evaluation. Of course, there's always going to be arguments on whether or not an evaluation is valid. And capacity, as we saw here, is still a work in progress in Uzbekistan, as it is in many countries, but there's a lot of movement in that front.
So, okay, what's ADB's project can say about the evaluation process in Uzbekistan?
projects in Uzbekistan are doing relatively well. The success rate is above average relative to other ADB projects. The challenge is that the country is growing very rapidly and the priorities here are changing very rapidly, and ADB has to adapt its support as the country changes its priorities.
What does the independent evaluation project of ADB Uzbekistan can say about it, and what could be done better, and what is already good?
So this exercise of independent.
Okay, so that's Enrico Pinali. He's formerly an evaluator, so he helped us package the messages as well. So that was just an example of how you say the right things. There is accountability, but you just package your messages in a way that it's more digestible, it's consumable for a certain set of audiences. Very quickly, also celebrating organizational success. If there's some good news for the country, like we had evaluated Nepal's small town water and sanitation project, it had good results. So you take it to the country, and you also celebrate the organization's success. So you're not always seen as people who are bringing bad news. And incentives, in a small way, we have an institution which every year we have IED awards, and that helps in some way to the betterment of self-evaluation, because we award staff from the operations on excellence in self-evaluation. So, and this is also a relationship building exercise for IED with the rest of the bank. I'll try and wrap up very quickly now, because I think I might be eating up into your time. This is some of the other products that we have. Asian Evaluation Week, ECG, our Evaluation Guru, partnership with country organizations like Niti Aayog, etc. I just wanted to bring this up because this cannot be taken for granted. When you are trying to focus on stakeholders, you cannot address everybody's needs. So there are people who are unmovable, who are not going to be converted. You spend, as communicators, we spend little or minimal persuasion for those people. And then there are people who are already your hardcore allies. Again, we spend minimal of our resources trying to, like the board of directors are already converted, right? So quickly to make that point, that it is when you choose your stakeholders to communicate with, there's a method in the madness, right? Next slide. Again, accessible, valued, and used. And last but certainly not the least, because we've heard this discussed, we were discussing with 3IE about the fact that the perception is that organizations like the World Bank and ADB have a lot of resources, so we can communicate better. I personally feel that if the resources are limited, it leads to more strategic communication. But that's my personal opinion. So when I joined IED about in 2018, being from the media, being from the television, I was big into these big mega videos. And we hired an international consultant, and we went to Armenia, and we shot a very, very beautiful video on women in SMEs. Very good technical quality. I was very pleased with it. We got 205 likes till date when we pushed it on our, on our web page. And then I came back in a very heartfelt blog I wrote on my surprising discovery about women's opportunities in Armenia, where we did speak about her evaluation. That immediately, till then, till I last saw, got 900 likes. So it is not about pushing big money. It is not about, it's just about great ideas that can be used for evaluation, right? And I think that should be my last slide. I'll just go on to the next one, and then I'll hand it over to Nilakshi.
Yeah. Couple of communication failures, but that's okay. Right.
Do you want to use something?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, that's right. Thank you. Maybe I can go back to the line about taking things for granted. I just would like to maybe have a show of hands. Do you think communication is intuitive? when we are speaking to different stakeholders or in the course of a research project. How many of you would think it's intuitive? Or you figure it out? You figure it out as you go along. Thanks. Or do you think it requires a strategy? You just spend 20 minutes on it.
No, I still go with intuitive. That's why all three of us are panelists, because I believe it's intuitive. And, yes.
So here I was speaking to my communication team, and I was like, why me for the panel? I think their point was, we want you to make a point here. While it is intuitive, there is a method to it. There is a reason to go back to some principles of communication if we want to be effective. And often when we are doing a project or when we are in the middle of research, we don't see the need to communicate. And I think the cartoon you put on at the beginning is just reflective of that. Yeah, I'd maybe start with broader principles. I'll try and steer clear of some of the ones that you've mentioned. I think those are in common, and that comes from being communication people. Sure. Not me, but my team. At 3IE, we look at, like I said yesterday, quality evidence that is useful for decision making. We, again, well, how many of you were there in the morning session? Maybe I can reference some of the principles from the morning session that we spoke about, the one Mark was sharing. Can I again have? Right. Some broader principles, I think those were addressed, but I want to go back to them. Communication as an opportunity. It's an opportunity all along the research cycle, not only towards the end. And I saw that a majority of the people here supported that throughout the research process, but I'm not really sure how true that is about different aspects. And that's talking inside the organization as well as outside the organization. Having communication people be part of the process, again, from the word go, so they understand what we are talking about. That takes an effort, it takes their time, it takes a certain bit of planning on part of the, if I may say, the project budgets as well as the organization's budget. That's just one of the principles. The other was about, the other point in the morning was maybe this window of opportunity that communication has. And again, that window of opportunity is different at different moments in time. You spoke about crisis and how we can't probably do the thinking, how we can't be effective communicators during a crisis if we haven't done some of that planning before. I think that's another important point with regard to communication. It's the point made by a policymaker. To me, to him, that is, what's important is how you are presenting a big report with regard to what's important and to who. That's what he looked at. And while we address different parts, and you did in your strategy, the point is how effectively are we using that in our organization. Next slide, just, yeah. Sorry, can I have the next slide? Oh, that is.
Yeah, the clicker.
The stakeholder engagement and communication plan is something we have for every project. At 3IE, we believe that only when evidence is accessible is it useful, or will it be taken up by key stakeholders. The key, again, is to having the research team be completely in sync with the communication team throughout the process. As an example of that, during our reviews, which are weekly on some of the projects, depending on the projects, we have communication people participate in the reviews. We have active input from them in terms of what's required. So right from the planning of the context analysis to the monitoring and evaluation learning, maybe I can, in the next slide, address one component of this with regard to a project that I'm sure everyone's heard of, the National Rural Livelihood Mission.
By now, yes.
Yes. Jeff, do you want to talk about this?
Is there a test after? Will it be on the test?
Yeah, you'll probably score high. This is a stakeholder mapping we did for NRLM. We started with details of who the key stakeholders were. And I would like to add, so what you see here is only a part of it. This is a living document, we update it. What you see here is a part of where we started, and it got updated along the process with different stakeholders. We looked at why would these stakeholders engage with research? What are they interested in? The program, when NRLM started, I think the stage we were going in for the evaluation, NRLM was interested in mid-course correction. They wanted to know what the program had managed to achieve, where can they look at for the next round, and there was going to be a next round. Coincidentally, they were happy with the results, and we're also doing the next round. How can we engage with the policymakers? Again, fairly intuitive, but I want to say these are the notes you come back to during the research process, and that can actually be helpful if things aren't going right or if there is a transition. How do we facilitate use? Again, how do we secure a buy-in from the government? Again, this might be very India or South Asia specific, but this is not something we can take for granted, even though it is a research that has been commissioned by the government or been asked for the government. The priorities change very quickly across stakeholders, across the government, even within the government, between individuals. The communication products and activities, coming to a specific aspect of what communication product would be required at what stage. The states, while the evaluation was a national level evaluation, we had to go to the states for several, both from implementations perspective, from capacity perspectives, as well as from them understanding what we are talking about. That's when we came up with state fact sheets. And Mark, you were asking this yesterday, how did we make this useful for states? I think a couple of examples, the fact sheets including SHG grading. What was the quality of SHGs at state level, even though it was a national evaluation? We came up with these products to see why the states would listen to us, how to engage with them. Grading of SHGs was one. Loans that were going to these SHGs were just another components on, I guess you were speaking about the design, but this is something that we address towards the findings as well. The state leadership, again, this has been a very, very high intensity and maybe a time-consuming process of engaging state leadership and state actors, but I'd say it has been useful because while we are going in with the next, for the next round of our evaluation, we're quite well versed with implementation at state level, and I think it was through communication and continuous communication, both of the communication team as well as our researchers, that we actually managed to do this. And it was also a way for us to strengthen capacity at state level. I think there's a takeaway that we have from this event. It's everyone mentioning the need to communicate to the ground. And to me, that's an audience we need to add, and that's not necessarily in our matrix as we have right now, and ways to communicate, how to communicate with them. But on the top of my head, one I can think of is the fact that we actually had some of the local players being involved in the evaluation. Some of the surveys that we had were local. That's at the start of data collection, but these are probably the surveys that you can communicate or involve at the end of the communication process, or sorry, the evaluation, to have them communicate again back to the community. That's just one of the ways, but I think the takeaway for me has been to include them as major audience because they are the primary audience of what we are talking about here. Again, what worked for us? The planning and the ongoing engagement with regard to involving different actors, including our own communication team at different parts. They were actively suggesting what we could do. Closed-door events was a suggestion, for instance, that came up. We held closed-door meetings with state governments. We had 9 states we were looking at. We held closed-door meetings with 5 of them to effectively seek research questions, have them co-create parts of the research. That's something that worked. We also understood the barriers very carefully. I want to go back to the capacity building. I think that was a barrier that we identified early on how the states may not necessarily have the capacity to understand or even give us the data we are looking for unless we speak to them why we need this data. And it worked. It was effective to have the monitoring and evaluation departments. It was also about finding, and I don't know if this is, I guess this is communication specific because the communication people were best equipped to handle this, who to ask for what. And when we are asking for data collection, I think we ultimately went to the monitoring and evaluation units within these departments to be specifically talking to be responsive. And for those who understand the context of India, it's not as intuitive as you might think to identify the stakeholder as the MEL because they're not as powerful as they should be at state level. But we identified them as an audience during the course of the study and worked with them. The translation of knowledge, 3IE study was quoted in the Indian Parliament within 1 week, within 1 month of it being released. Over the last couple of years, it has been quoted on numerous occasions. I think it's all attributable to the policymakers understanding the communication we had with them, us effectively feeling that we need to communicate to them. Quickly wanted to speak about contribution tracing. This is something that is developing and evolving within 3IE, but that's, before we make an evidence claim, what is the process we need to follow? How do we claim that our finding has been used for evidence? And that's a very interesting process to follow. It's been a learning, and like I said, it's been evolving. It's evolving at 3IE. The challenges. Can I go to my notes for this because my communication team wants me to reference this very carefully. So, the budget, you spoke about it. The question is, where should the budgets go? Are these project-specific requirements? Are these organizational requirements? What goes where? Broader principles? Who answers that? We are learning, we are figuring that out as an organization, and again, maybe the scale we are at has something to do with that, but that's a question I have, but great to have everybody's inputs on it. We, of course, need to work closely with stakeholders, and you spoke about positive communication, I think that's something we experienced with our evaluation of NRLM. It was important to have that trust build up over time before you can communicate the non-intended results of a communication as well. And it was the trust element and understanding the context and the program guidelines, the program implementation that helped us communicate that effectively. So yeah, I think those were pretty much the points I wanted to make. Thanks. Have I taken up too much time?
No, you're just fine. Yeah.
Hope, yeah, you don't have a presentation.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I was worried I would forget how to speak without one, so bear with me. In IG, we have a really, really good communications team. I am not a communications person. I don't have a Twitter account. I don't have an Instagram account. I don't have a Snapchat account. I am not the typical audience for most communications, so I rely on them to tell me the stuff that I wouldn't even think about. One thing that I do give them credit for is they give us all a lot of leeway in how we communicate things, particularly when it's subject matter expertise. We're more likely to know who the audience is than they are. So what I'm going to talk about are my experiences in what seems to work, and I say seems to because from my perspective, they seems to work. And first, let me differentiate between internal versus external communication. So internal communication that's our dissemination of our findings within the institution. The one thing that I can say with 100% certainty is we think our work is more interesting than anyone else thinks it is. And so I think initially there's a temptation to want to do sort of standalone branded events. This is IEG, come to us. And then you realize that the people that we're trying to reach are incredibly busy, and there's all sorts of demands on their time. And you know, as interesting as it may be, it's unlikely that many of them will have the time to come to an IEG event. And so what I try to do is go where they are, which means if their department has a learning week, you try to get on the agenda. Rather than have BBLs and workshops on how to do self-evaluations, the ICRs, I don't host those. What I do is when the institution does its DPL Academy, its PBL Academy, I get on there and I do a session, because that's a captive audience. It means that it's not branded as IEG. And what one has to accept is there is sometimes a trade-off between influence and recognition. And there, I'm prepared to trade off recognition in order to get influence. I'll do a lot of dissemination by going to management team meetings and talking about what we're doing in specific evaluations. And I know that if I were to host an IEG event that's all branded, none of them will come because they don't have the time to come. So that's a big part of internal dissemination, and I think we often underestimate the time constraint and the competing demands on the people we want to reach. So go to where they are is my main piece of advice. Externally, I think it's important to realize, first of all, we have, you talk about stakeholders. I like to think about just, we have multiple audiences, and you need to communicate differently to all those audiences, and communication seems to work best when it's a two-way thing. And I think it's important to recognize that the ability of other people to talk to me is a function of who else is in the room. So someone is, in some countries, they are unlikely to say something critical in front of a different audience. So I'm going to give you the example of recent dissemination we did of the country program evaluation for Mozambique. This was the first post-COVID dissemination of a country program evaluation. The last one that we did was actually right before COVID, and it was the Philippines, and we did it at the ADB. And I remember flying over, we changed planes in Narita, we turned on our phones, it said all non-essential travel is suspended. We ignored it and carried on and had a really good time in Manila. But it was really useful. So the first thing is we've stopped doing publications. We don't print very much anymore. So the World Bank group in Mozambique is this card, and it links to the evaluation, some blogs related to the evaluation, some past stuff. And the best part is it's all in Portuguese on the other side. Local language. You want to communicate even to people who speak English, it's better to communicate in local language. So we did our dissemination event with simultaneous translation, our blogs, the evaluation, mainly the overview. No, we didn't do the whole thing because it can be very expensive, but everything's on here. We don't spend an awful lot of money, and these things are really handy. We've got another one here for our podcasts. I'm the co-host of the podcast. I should mention, I don't listen to podcasts. I've never listened to one of my podcasts. You'll have to let me know how it is. So when we went to Mozambique,
champion.
I don't even have cable, right? I just complete Luddite. So when we went to Mozambique, we actually organized 5 sessions around 5 different audiences. And we started off at the university. And we did a session, we found a professor who wanted to endorse us, and we did a session with a bunch of graduate students. Now, I was a little sneaky. This was practice. We wanted to practice what we were going to do when we got to the other audiences. But we were also trying to build awareness of the World Bank, build interest in evaluation. And to be entirely honest, the discussion was very unfiltered. University students will ask you really tough questions, and so it's great practice. We generated a huge amount of enthusiasm, which was very encouraging. So then we went on, and the rest of what we had is we had one public event, and we did it jointly with the International Growth Center, the local office. They know who the audiences are. They know who the people are. We cut a check, the organization. We had vice ministers. We had a really interesting collection of folk. We actually lucked out because I like to talk about Mozambique a lot, but there was something called, as I mentioned in another session, the hidden debt crisis. During our public session, the former finance minister who was living in South Africa was extradited to the United States to face fraud charges. So when our session ended, there were all this media out there, and so we were all over the place. It was it wasn't planned, but it was great. We had a separate session with government officials, because the kind of questions they're going to ask, they're not going to ask in a public setting. And so we gave them that safe space, and they had different issues to talk about. We had a separate session with the development partners, and while we did invite the World Bank there, we did it separately from the session we did with the World Bank office. because development partners had very different questions. And one of the questions they wanted to ask us about was what we thought about this pooled budget support that had been provided along with the World Bank. We talked to them separately, and then we did a session with the country office. What was interesting is in all of them, there was a lot of discussion, and we made sure to leave as much time as possible for discussion. One thing I like about this event is that there is discussion at the end. At the World Bank, I always find it fascinating when they advertise a workshop or a seminar. There are so many speakers that you're lucky if there's any discussion. You want people to remember what you're saying, give them a chance to interact with you. That ended up being a very, very successful event. We've decided to use that as our model for country program evaluations. And it's acknowledging that we need separate audiences, separate messaging. It means we have to purge the jargon from what we deliver. We have to purge the acronyms, which is really, really hard to do because sometimes we forget what the acronyms mean. I kid you not, at the bank we have something called the Completion Learning Review, which is the self-evaluation at the end of a strategy. But everyone calls them the CLRs. So we decided our validation product was going to be the CLR Review. And then we realized that that was the Completion Learning Review. And it kept showing up in documents as an error because Word thought, oh, word repeat. We've just changed it to CLRV, but we forget what these things mean. One of my most traumatic experiences was having to deliver a presentation on an evaluation in French because all the acronyms are different, and that was nightmarish. I will never do that again. I guess the last thing I want to say is, like I said, local language, and actually get rid of jargon. And if anyone would like a copy of the World Bank Group in Mozambique in English or Portuguese, well, actually, this is Doug's. I forgot to bring mine. And I actually didn't realize I had it with them. You don't have to carry boxes of books when you travel as well, which is really nice. And I'm happy to give you all of the ones in the podcast, and please let me know what you think of it.
All these commercials were paid for. So I'm certain that between the three of us, we've answered all your questions. So, but if you all have any questions, Sonia. Sure, after that, and then.
Yeah, very quickly. It was an absolutely amazing session, and it brought back a few memories, so I just wanted to share one of them. So I used to work a lot on environment safeguards when I started my development career at the World Bank. And of course, on large transport highways projects, right, in India, there's a lot of politics in that, which I, as a very young, that time young person, didn't know. So go there and, we are going to do this road, World Bank is going to do this, that, and, you know, oh, sorry. And little did I know that, so this was my, big tryst with learning what to say, how to say, to whom, and in which language. So, of course, on all of these highway projects, there's so many local politicians, right? And suddenly there was all this feedback flowing in that, there's going to be property development, the land value is going to increase, and it's traveling back to the World Bank, and there was a certain World Bank mission that went and said all of this on environment, social issues, and it was early, I think, early days in the highway program in India, and late 90s when the environment, social regulations were growing in India, and the operational directives of the World Bank had just come out. So it was that kind of gap where I think the implications of saying what to say to whom and in which language wasn't so well known. So I just wanted to share that, and this local language translation of the environment impact assessment and also the resettlement action plan made a world of a difference. But some damage control had to be done in a different language. But yeah, it was a very interesting learning. And so thank you for raising all of these brilliant issues. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for sharing that with us. I think we have a couple of people who, and then we'll come to Twinkle.
Yeah, please go ahead. You go ahead. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah,
We
sure.
can just pass the microphone down after.
No, it's okay.
Thank you. I'm Steven. I'm from ID Insight. I just have one comment and two questions for Nilakshi. So the first comment, just the point on the difficulties of trying to budget for comms, very much resonates with me. I think it's too easy to cut those budgets first, especially when you need to prioritize actual research or evaluation activities. So that's something that we're also still trying to find an answer to. The two questions that I had, both of which are related, are one of the earlier slides that you presented, which mentioned in the context analysis, looking for, in the partner that you're working with, a culture of evidence use. And I wanted to ask sort of how you measure that, or like what specifically you look for, if there are specific indicators or if it's more of like a broad definition. And two, what you do with those findings. Do you just sort of take them as is, or in the process of that relationship with that partner, with that government, are there any instances or is there any willingness to try to strengthen the culture of evidence use throughout the course of that engagement?
Sure. Should I? Yes. Okay. Again, my communication team might answer that better, but the part I've been involved with is understanding how in this case, how the department or the ministry actually uses evidence, whether there is a precedence around that. Have they, for instance, in this particular case, do they have a department that actually feeds into the regular process of giving them evaluation apart from the monitoring? Every unit in the context of India has a monitoring unit, but whether that's actually being used, the studies that they are doing around it, normally they're qualitative, and I wouldn't say just, qualitative studies that they're doing around. Again, instances of use in media that we can identify of them quoting these studies, different at national level and different at state level. I can tell you, which I won't, but I can offline, the states in India that we have recognized as being more supportive along different indicators, and I wouldn't be able to give you a list. I think these were just some of the indicators that are used by us to identify that. But the ones who are supportive, sometimes it's just individuals and the person who comes right there at that point. But in general, I'd say media use, quoting evidence in media, using, again, some basic findings. Second, the number of studies they tend to do at state level, the budget allocation they have towards evaluation apart from monitoring. Normally, monitoring is the common budgets that they have, very little for evaluations. Just some of the indicators that they have. Sorry, did you have a second question?
It was, so let's say that you do that in the beginning of an engagement and you find that their culture of evidence use, I don't know how you grade it, but let's say it's like medium, low. So then throughout the course of the project, will you work with them to try to like sort of boost their capacity or their culture of evidence use?
Again, that the rating is not constant. It varies, and we probably need to, again, it's a living document kind of thing. We have tried to work with them through the discussions and the workshops, and then engaging with their different units for even data collection, as well as during the process. Every visit that we do, normally even before in the pre-analysis stage, involves the state, but still looking at broader engagements on capacity building, trying to figure that out. And I mentioned that yesterday as part of my panel. How much time and bandwidth do we want to invest in that, and whether we want to do that ourselves, what part do we want to come in at, is something that we are trying to figure out. Because it's a huge demand all across, but I think we need to figure out as an organization which bits we want to come in at. Thanks.
Right. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Claudia Ibargüen. I work at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. I want to bring up a tool, a communication tool that we all use. I'm sure that every single person in this room has used it, if not very often, at least, a few times in their career. It has been used during this week. It's used when we present findings to the executive, to our governing bodies, to our clients, between us, to our peers, to our colleagues. I don't know if some of you might have thought what this tool is, and I wanted to ask you and maybe others, what to do about this tool, because I have to be honest, I think it sometimes comes against us. I have a particular love-hate relationship with this, and this is PowerPoint. We use it all the time. You've all heard probably the death by PowerPoint. And I do have to acknowledge that, for example, in your presentations, it was so interesting what you were saying. At the same time, I was trying to read because I knew that there were tidbits up there that were also interesting. And at some point, I could not juggle both. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't do it, right? Yeah. But we get this, and we've been trying to really simplify our PowerPoint, because I know that when we communicate to, for example, our governing bodies, their bandwidth is very limited. If they are reading our 20 bullet points and then trying to listen to us, it's not going to happen. So I just wanted to hear what you thought about this, the tool that is so ubiquitous that we all use, but that sometimes comes back to haunt us and to bite us, and that goes against what we're trying to achieve, which is to communicate very simply and the most important things, and that it sticks, right? Because if it doesn't stick,
yeah. So I'll give you my personal.
Should we take a couple of questions?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Can I just quickly answer that, and then very, very briefly? So it's about, in my understanding, individual understanding as a communicator, of matching my tool of communication with the audience. So if it was a group of communicators, probably I would not have used a PowerPoint presentation. We would have just sat around and done something else, right? So by using a PPT, of course, it's based on presumption as well, that this is the tool that is most aligned with the audience that I'm trying to address. So, yeah. I think that, yeah, Mark.
I want to ask a question. It's a little bit of devil's advocate here. The most traumatic regime change I've lived through was from Obama to Trump. and then, by the way, to Trump to Biden was a relief. But I can say that because I'm not a U.S. government official here, okay? The most traumatic, second most traumatic regime change was Vino Thomas at IEG to Caroline Hyder and subsequently to Alison Evans. And I mention this because Vino had a very, many people here know Vino Thomas, I think. So yeah, he's a great guy. I have a lot of respect for him. But when I arrived at IEG many years ago, and he was the DG, he had a very explicit policy, and a communications person there, Melanie Zipper is her name, whose job it was to get evaluation findings out to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, to the Washington Post. And the idea was, if you did not get out tough messages and get them out loudly, you would not influence the World Bank or force them to respond.
Correct.
Now, I've heard several people here say, you must be constructive. You cannot use gotcha moments. That's going to destroy the message. But I sometimes also am alert or concerned about whether constructive means quieting down, accommodating, avoiding difficult messages. We know politicians don't want to hear bad messages. We know that management of the World Bank does not want a tough report, and we've all faced that. So my question is, how do you really balance that and get to controversial issues and make those known both inside and outside?
Yeah. Okay. Let's take two questions.
Okay. Thanks. I'm Ricardo Palestra. I'm Chief Evaluation Officer at the World Health Organization. I was particularly interested in getting a sense of the different angles that you were looking at, but you talk very much about evaluation from a product perspective, and to some extent process also. I missed the function as a whole. Where's the communication strategy for an evaluation function? Because an evaluation function is, I think, something beyond an evaluation. It's sometimes an oversight function, sometimes it's an organizational learning function. It has different configurations. It's a development effectiveness one. According to that, and sometimes you're even a knowledge broker. maybe in the case of 3IE, there are some dimensions of knowledge, and maybe if the impact is contributing to the global knowledge of the basing on the mandate of the organization. So how do you influence the uptake of those meta-evaluations or those evidence gap maps that you do, rather than specific products? So I wanted to get your take and your 3 takes on an evaluation function beyond an evaluation product. What are the core components of an evaluation, of a communication strategy?
Thank you. My name is Sardar. I work for Food and Agriculture Organization. Maybe a related question to this one on products. For each evaluation that your organization is undertaking, what would be the must-have set of communication products or other services that the communication team is delivering? And what would be the good to have, like what more you can add to that? Thank you very much.
Okay, I think so, yeah.
My name is Sophie. So I wanted to follow up on the point that Manny was talking about before the morning, but I think he was mentioning about framing, right? So a lot of times when we work with the government, and I don't want to name the government, but in one of our engagement that we had, because of the political culture at that point in time, the government was very clear that we can only highlight the positives, right? And we as evaluators might have faced that. So how do you deal with these challenges, and how do you frame even a negative message in a positive light, so to say?
Okay.
I really want to answer that.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So for the sake of efficiency, we can divide the questions among ourselves. Yeah, Eric.
Okay, so comment and then two questions. So, you know, in my knowledge management evaluation, we spoke to head of communication of one of these very large for-profit consulting groups about, you know, when they do their reports and the sort of the dissemination and all of that. And what she told me is you gotta, you know, it's not getting it in the New York Times, or it's not how many times it was cited in, it was not how many times it was cited in different magazines. It's how do you, it's did you get the right readers to read it? So then the next question is, yeah, but how do you measure that? And her response was something like, look, if you're not measuring that, then don't even bother. I mean, you know, you either come up with a system that you can measure that, which probably means the person who communicates has to report it. They have to report how they communicated to the Vice Prime Minister of India. It has to be on record, and that person's boss has to recognize it. That, you know, you can't do metrics that are simple, you know, metrics that you just put in a spreadsheet. It takes work, but it's worth doing. You know, if she wants to justify why the consulting firm is spending so much money on sort of giving away free knowledge. She said we moved long from just counting the number of views and things like that. Just not useful. Just not really useful in terms of what is our real impact. Okay, so that was just a comment. So 2 questions. I don't have Snapchat or TikTok or any of that, just like you. But what about people like me who like books? I'm so sad. I mean, I know it's not politically correct anymore, but I miss books. I really miss that. What about people like us? So that's
get on to LinkedIn and be less sad.
That's number. Oh, I don't have cable TV either. That's number 1. Number 2 is who, Saleha, are your implacable opponents that you ignore? I'm just curious. Who do you think are the implacable opponents? I want name. Yeah. No. But yeah. What types of people? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So if it doesn't get outside the room, that's an easy one. If there's a country office and you taking absolutely damning findings to them, there's a high chance that they're not going to be converted. So it varies from evaluation to evaluation. But are there any more questions? Manny has a question, yeah.
I think I'm the meta evaluator because I'm the only one in this room, probably in this town, that has worked in each of your organizations. So I know what you're talking about, and I know what you're hiding.
So, whoa.
No, so my question really is related to a number of things that have come up on measuring and the budget question. And that's why I was going to ask you, Nilakshi, if you could tell us a little bit more about contribution tracing. Certainly when I was 3IE, one of the main things that determined whether or not we got the grant for doing an evaluation was what the donor said, how are you going to measure whether you've had an influence? And it answers, and so we came up with this tool of contribution tracing. And I was wondering just if you could tell us a little bit more, tell them a little bit more about what that means, and to put a little more discipline into making sure that it's not just, oh, we got quoted, I'm going to write that down, or very anecdotal. And it's tough, and I think it's really hard. I was just wondering whether, Jeff, you could tell us about, or Saleha, what is a good measure for you to answer the question, are we making a difference? And I think to answer, Mark, to your question too on, when is it that you go to the New York Times? Is what's the purpose of your communications? Is it to get in the newspaper or to change behavior? So in some cases, in some cases, I would say it's only to change behavior, because otherwise, if I were the board of directors, if it's to get in the New York Times, well, that's right. So that's when is it that the New York Times is a good vehicle? And that's what I call the nuclear option, okay? And that's when it's really got to be important. But to get some task manager or some sector group to change the way it's doing projects, I don't think so. Anyway, that's just a thought. Yeah. But anyway, if you could, that is my question.
One? Should I just take the messaging?
Why don't we take a turn?
Okay, I can, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I also don't have a subscription to the New York Times. I'm going to borrow yours. I think actually, first of all, I agree on the PowerPoint thing. Just very quickly, that I remember getting some training. It says, don't do text slides where you have all this stuff. So I think if you are going to use it, put as few things on there as possible. And don't clutter it with graphics and pretty Anyway, so that's my pet peeve. The trade-off between influence and recognition. One of my concerns is that a lot of the metrics we use to determine whether or not we're having influence are based on recognition, the number of times. And those are not the same things, and sometimes they work against one another. Some of the most influential things that I've been involved in, most people don't know about. And that was a condition for having influence, is not giving up the recognition. In terms of how forthright you can be with your findings, this is Mark's point, sometimes because we want things to be easy, we will sugarcoat the message, and a lot of the people we talk to will hear what they want to hear. So unless you have the substance there, yes, it will be received nicely, but it'll also be ignored. I had a boss once who was a great communicator, and he said that he used to deliver messages like sandwiches. And he said, so if you had something tough to say, you would have a nice thing to say, and then the meat would be the tough thing, and then the other side would be the nice thing. He said, what he realized eventually, people were just ignoring the meat and just paying attention to the nice things that were said on either side. I think the answer is partly audience. Right? There are some audiences you can be more direct with. And what I found in delivering findings that are very critical of management is you have to make sure that your language is neutral, your data is clear, and that most recently we did this evaluation of domestic revenue mobilization, and the finding was, despite all the rhetoric about all the work that we were doing, we had dropped the ball and done very little. That's a tough message, but we delivered it by, here's the data, here's how many here's how many interventions we did. This is who we did them for. You can't deny the data. And we let the data speak for itself. And then the board amplified it and got very, very critical, so we didn't have to use that language. But you want to understate the language. You want the substance to speak, not the choice of words. When we're doing country program evaluations and dissemination, there are some countries where we're not going to communicate the same way we did. We were lucky when we went to Mozambique because everyone was very concerned about the sensitivity about talking about governance and corruption. I was actually surprised at how open the government officials were because they were trying to distance themselves from the past. And so they ended up being much harder hitting in their language, but we gave them the data on which to do that. There are some places where we're not going to go and do dissemination of country program evaluations because we can't say what we need to say. And we just have to accept that. And that partly gets to the budget issue. We used to sort of say everyone would have a certain percentage of their budget for dissemination, but not everything needs to be disseminated, and not everything can be effectively disseminated. So we're very strategic. We'll do this, but we won't do this. And it means that other things have to be kind of lower key, but I think we're more impactful that way.
I'll just also add to the messaging bit, because that's something that we do on a regular basis. I think, Mark, you brought it up, and then you talked about what is the must-haves. So in addition to everything that you've said, that influence, in my experience, is rather complicated. And to be able to, so the first step of dissemination we do of our evaluations is through a newsletter, a news release that we make public. So one of the news releases that was really picked up, in fact some NGOs picked it up, was about ADB saying no to coal. And it was picked up by newspapers, etc. But everybody went on board, talked about it, but did it influence ADB? Did ADB actually say no to coal? No. Because there were other constraints that were there, there were other considerations that were there. So, so it's all about packaging messages that we do, and literally there was a point, yeah, Manny, you wanted to say?
Eventually it did, but not necessarily because of the
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just saying it's complicated, maybe not. I mean, you just have to be a little, light-footed about it. And as he said, sandwich. The news release is an example where we sit and we think of, so the headline has to be soft, and the first paragraph can be hard-hitting, and some of the messages can be sandwiched in between, and that's how you get the messages out. So it's a balancing act that we end up doing. It's not ideal, but yeah. Manny's like.
Where the headline's got to be sexy, otherwise people won't.
Yeah, I could lose my job, but who cares?
Yeah, Manny, I wonder if you want to answer your own question, but I feel like I'm being tested here. But it's again very debated, as you know, inside with regard to what we would consider, and maybe it's sort of the perspective I have brought into this, and again, it's not everybody's shared perspective. Budget shifts that we think can, any finding or parts of the finding that might be leading to a budget shift that has been acknowledged by a policymaker, not us sort of assuming that budget shift, in some cases maybe assuming, but the level of, and I'm giving just some of the things we've used because just to make it more concrete, the level it's being said at, and then again a subpoint to the level of the policymaker is a minister quoting a finding may just be saying it worked. However, maybe an interaction with a policymaker saying this was, even if it's a closed door, this is what the finding was and this is what it led to. Again, in the case of loans, one of our findings led to a release of loans as was acknowledged in a closed door meeting by the policymaker. That's something we would point towards that. Again, a little bit of distinction between the use of positive findings and maybe constructive, if I may, the constructive findings. Positive findings making it in the news is not in all instances a claim that you can make as evidence being used. It's pretty much saying, we thought this program was going to work and it did, and this policy worked. Told you so. But maybe dividing that in parts, saying, did that lead to, again, release a further, the next round of it? Did it mean a greater increase? Was that actively debated in Parliament? Even that by itself has brought attention to the program. That's just some of the points of the debate and discussion we are at right now within the contribution tracing. I think Jeff answered the bit about null findings and also the PowerPoint, but just in terms of a global, I feel your point referenced cross-learning and maybe larger, just getting at a larger point of view with regard to communication. Maybe it's an unintended thing, but I think with 3IE it happens because our communication team is global. Most of the products that we have, and even with regard to an active exchange, I think we are trying to propagate the use across of, be it EGMs, across programs, or actively going to policymakers and telling them this is sort of the services we can bring for them to understand what can be done. Yeah.
Question of
yeah. Oh, what? Okay.
No one answered.
The function,
a little. I think one of the hardest things for evaluators to do is to talk about evaluation without using jargon. And as soon as they use jargon, no one knows what they're talking about. If you want to communicate the importance of evaluation, I think you have to make sure that the language is tailored to who you're communicating it to. And I think we're not great at that. We can always be better.
On the most basic step of communication.
Use a PowerPoint.
Oh, good. Yeah. Mark's comment stimulated me to think a little bit that, yes, you could go to the New York Times, but would you have been more influential if the New York Times had come to you? And the reason I ask that is when I was in Ford Foundation, we did basically no publication, no communication, no packaging for our work in China, because we said our grantees are our communication, that what we fund, what we decided not to fund, what they achieved was the communication. And so it was a little bit like Sir Christopher Wren's grave in a major church in London is one of the paving stones, but what's written on it is, if you seek my monument, look around you, and it's this absolutely incredible church. So that I wonder if a very basic element of communication for influence is the quality of the work we do, so that people come to ask us about our findings rather than perhaps are we, in a sense, sometimes pushing everything out there to get the metrics of communication up, but the quality may not be behind it. And maybe more thinking about what we need to communicate to who, and not to overload people with communication, could help to sharpen the message. It's just a thought.
Yeah, we agree with you.
We have a consensus, yay.
Is there anyone who doesn't have a question?
Yeah. So, did you want an answer? Because we agree with you.
Yeah, we agree with you.
Yeah. It's a challenge because what happens in our institutions is the metrics is around number of publications, and that goes back to the comment before.
Yeah.
If I do a good process, nobody has a metric for that.
Yeah.
But if I have, when I was in a resident mission in one country, I would get boxes of publications. Please disseminate these to the ministries. And I would go around and knock, knock, knock. I'm really busy, go away. Knock, knock, knock. I have to just give you this. What is it? Well, it's 160 pages in a language you can't read, but the cover looks nice. Oh, why do I need to know it now? I said, well, what do you need to know? And when we did our knowledge strategy for that country, we put in the one thing that they did request from us was, can you give us just-in-time knowledge? And I said, well, what does that mean to you? They said, look, you've done evaluations. Don't give us the evaluation report. Wait till we are at the point when I'm writing the brief to the minister, and then tell me what are the 2 or 3 major things out of your studies that I should put into that. So we put that into the country knowledge plan. And, you know, the hardest thing was we couldn't deliver on it because the whole system wasn't set up to synthesize all of that communication material into having the right things that the user needed at the right time. So that in evaluation, when we talk about getting the right things to people at the right time to be used, that's a huge challenge still for all of us. And I don't know the answer, I just throw it out there.
If I could just on that, I mean, one of the things that I think is worth thinking about, I remember these 250 page publications, and I'm less likely to open a single page of something that's 250 pages long than I am something that's relatively brief. And often as evaluators, we want to show everyone how much we know. So we put everything into the report, and sometimes it goes into annexes, and it's a horrible description. Or what we want to do is replicate our thought process in the publication, and that doesn't make for anything that's readable. And so my staff, I think I've driven them absolutely insane because I keep giving them, handing them back 150-page documents and saying, look, bring me back 60 and then we'll work with that. But it's really tough because you've got to kill your darlings. It's like, I love this, I don't want to get rid of this text. You think everything's important. And sometimes I think the best thing to do is hand it to a friend or someone who knows nothing about the topic. And if they hand it back to you and say, I have no idea what you're talking about, or I couldn't get halfway through it, then you know there's a problem. But we don't like to do that because we don't want that scrutiny. But I think it's helpful to have it.
No, I mean, absolutely. I saw Manny smiling that about readability of reports, brevity and readability of reports, that it almost seems like it's, if you're paying too much attention to the readability, some people have an opinion that you're compromising on the content. Then it is not either or situation. The more readable you make it, the better an evaluation report is. Do you want to say anything on? Now you have to.
No. Everyone knows I'm just on this campaign for message-driven report writing, because I do think we have a tendency as researchers, because evaluators are primarily researchers. First of all, with the exception of a couple of the people who are here. By and large, if you get you're a researcher, you tend to be, you like to get closed up in a room and do your stuff and not bother with others. And so people tend to write what they've done. And certainly I think we've seen that. It's the reason it's 160 pages is here's everything I've done to justify why I spent a year on this report. As opposed to, what are the 5 messages that you want people to get? And then make sure that your report supports those 5 messages, because that's all people will remember. So it's been a challenge, I think, for everybody, but it's got to be done. It is, so, but it is something that doesn't come as naturally to some people as it does to others.
The other quick point, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
The other quick point on that was, again, it came up in the morning, actionable. I think for several people, it's the actionable. It's the toughest thing, I guess, to make actionable recommendations, not necessarily one supporting one view or the other, but I think just breaking down findings in the point of what it looks like next, or what it could possibly look like next. Yeah.
So we have time just for one more question. You can, yeah.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Cassandra Barnes. I'm from ID Insight, and I actually work in communications.
Oh, lovely.
So this session was very, very refreshing. For once, I know exactly what's going on compared to all the other ones that were really focused on evaluation.
You were at the procurement session, I take it.
Yeah, from your session. So I think a lot of things have been brought up recently, and I think I just wanted to build on what Sir Manny has said about, you know, kind of like how we build a culture around evaluations. We also have to build a culture around communicating what we do. And a lot of that is of internal shifts, like internal initiatives or like internal practices that we do to encourage that culture of communications among us, among you researchers, and people who might not be so intuitive about that sort of approach. So I was wondering, for all three of you, maybe you could share some like best practices, little nudges that you've done internally in your organizations that have helped build this culture of being more open and communicative about their work.
Yeah. I can take the first stab at it, and I think that it was very triumphant for the team, communications team, when we have been able to introduce communications at the start of the evaluation cycle, because till very recently it was seen as something that you do at the end. So, and even now, I mean, till 6 months ago, when you know, the evaluation team started doing it, they were unhappy. They said, we've got many other things to do. And some amount of cracking of the whip from the management, some amount of hand-holding from us, and we're getting there. So I would say that that is something that is a must, and I think that absolutely should be done. I think that in some senses, we're hopeful that it might even, if you think of the messaging beforehand, and if you think of the audiences at the early stage, it might lend to better reports as well, hopefully.
I think I mentioned this at the start of my presentation, but just getting all the teams together in one room with regard to even the research question, I think they may not be actively participating, or but it's exceedingly relevant for long-term communication plans to have everyone at the same level with regard to what is it that we are looking at. And this is throughout the process. It has been one of the keys. Actively seeking communication suggestions on sometimes even interactions, that possible interactions with whatever stakeholder we are talking about. It helps to have someone a little removed from the process coming in and just saying, this is what the person was really saying, and you may want to look at it like this, because sometimes you're just so attached to the idea that you don't let go. And we found this in the terms of learning notes that we were preparing for policymakers. That was very helpful. Yeah, I think that was, the key is just having the teams together and having active suggestions from either side, even with regard to the products that are required, even though you haven't built them in. But if it comes up that it's a requirement that the communication team sees to be more effective, just being open to it.
The only thing I would add, so I used to think that blogs were what people wrote when they didn't have the time or discipline to actually do research and analysis. But what I find now is after we've done a report, then I'll write a blog. And when you write a blog, you're not summarizing the report. You have to think of one thing, maybe two, that are worth communicating. And that's more likely what people are going to remember. They're not going to remember the whole thing. And so that's how I'm using blogs. And I think it's effective. But it's after all the work's done, then you decide what you're going to pull out.
Right. I think time is up, and thank you so much on behalf of all of us here and the communications team, which is standing behind, for taking time and being part of this. It means a lot to all of us. Thank you.
And now a chorus of Bohemian Rhapsody.
Now, so you want to flash the results?
This is fairly certain even at the beginning.